In the past couple of weeks, we've witnessed an ongoing discussion about whether or not Jews are guilty of cultural appropriation if we sing the Negro spiritual, "Let My People Go," at a Passover Seder. An op-ed from Shekhiynah Larks generated much of this year's communal conversation, and it was the push and pull that we saw on social media that sparked our observations about appropriation, appreciation, and beyond.
This is Jews Talk Racial Justice with April and Tracy,
a weekly show hosted by April Baskin and Tracy Guy-Decker.
In a complex world, change takes courage.
Wholehearted relationships can keep us accountable.
We want to raise a topic that was widely discussed this year on Passover that is not only tied to Passover, that touches upon other themes that come up.
So there was a conversation on social media that I witnessed. I did not weigh in on. I rarely do, to be honest, where there was discussion about what to do when one realizes that something, a practice that they do, is appropriative. And there's one call to action, which just says, stop doing it. Don't do the thing because it's appropriative. And when you and I were talking before we hit record, we were saying, well, maybe there's a way to move from appropriation to appreciation. And then you pushed me further.
Yeah. Because I think that's like a phrase. I don't know who the source is. There's likely, I don't know if it's so common that we can't pinpoint who originally said that, but appreciation versus appropriation, or appreciation instead of appropriation. But to me, that alone isn't enough, because I think lots of people who are appropriating are appreciating. And so for me, I would add not simply to not appropriate, but instead to do something that, and again, even this, there's still more power dynamics, but that appreciates, attributes, is accountable to its source. Lots of great A's here. that incorporates awareness about the original source and really weighs, is this something that do I even need to engage in this at all? If I am a white person with no Native heritage, do I really need to have feathers in my hair? Is that, in the context of the United States, is that so helpful? If in fact that is something that is deeply tied. And even there, if someone grew up in a rural area in the wilderness and was surrounded by birds and happened to live off of the land, so for me here, story really matters. And I think one piece that I wanted to bring up here is that it's interesting, because when you talk about, in your framing, and it actually helps me understand how this happens, that at times, I don't know if this is best for, but people essentially throw out the baby with the bath water. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That when you say, when someone's, there's at times there are calls to simply stop and or remove the appropriative piece. And when you say it like that, it sounds so clean and good and makes a lot of sense. But I think in my experience as someone who's been a consultant and guide and coach to different organizations and leaders as they've been navigating some of these conversations, I find that it's rarely, sometimes, but it's rarely that either or dichotomy of simply just as if it's like a surgery, like removing a mole or something, as opposed to it being certain things there being story and narrative and context and deeper dynamics. I think for instance, just as an example, with Let My People Go, I was reading some of the comments, and I too was mostly reading it, and I have a lot of opinions and thoughts about it, both from my own personal experience and part of what I'm speaking about now more generally, about ways that I think it's important in these conversations to have a good balance of humility, of wisdom, of trying to get a broader perspective and understand historical elements if those are part of what's happening. And one of the comments that I saw that I didn't quite like the way they were using it, but I was like, but that is true, is I think it was a white Ashkenazi Jewish man saying in a comment, somebody I didn't know, a friend of a friend, well, if we're going to talk about appropriation, this was in the context of it being removal, which either or also creates this adversarial, which at times that's necessary, but a lot of times it also isn't. An adversarial dynamic. And he said, if we're going to talk about appropriation, if anyone has claim to Moses, I think it's Jews. So what comes first here? And I didn't actually like the way he said it, but
Right.
in a different context, I was like, that to me, that's a part of, that to me would be an element of an interesting conversation to have about cultural overlap and fluidity and shared experiences. And as someone who studied this for my thesis and read a book called Black Zion, that was a scholarly work that documented Black encounters with Judaism, particularly, but not exclusively, but mostly in the United States, from enslavement forward, there's just a number of layers here. So when we are talking about these things, I like for a simple, tight phrase about, instead of appropriation, looking at aware, accountable appreciation. Was there a word for like permission? Asking, for there to be mindfulness, because I don't want everything separate. As someone who is multiracial, I always find, and deeply intercultural, who's lived in many different contexts and has access to a lot of cultures, some of which people may not know. And I don't always feel like I need to explain that I was born in the Deep South, that I've lived in the Midwest, that as a little girl, I wanted to be a cowgirl, that I feel deeply connected to belly dance, right? And it's not specifically my cultural heritage, but I don't know if it's a past life or specifically parts of my healing. But then again, the way I approach belly dance is with profound humility and being mindful about when and where I perform it or consider teaching it, who's in the room, and are there other people who are more proximate to that legacy with whom I can connect. But I don't want to not have belly dance in my life, but I navigate it with reverence. It doesn't fit with the A, right? But with reverence and responsibility and humility. This has been a hot topic that I've considered us talking about over and over again, Tracy. And because there are so many layers and nuances, I've been avoiding it, but I feel like we've built up a meaningful body of work and our relationship is really solid and it feels like the right time. So I'm glad that we're talking about it. And what I just want to clarify or make very clear, as I do at times on podcasts, is that I really invite people to hold the nuance of what Tracy and I are speaking about. There are times where appropriation is egregious, where the descendants of people who killed Native Americans are still dressing up and acting like Native people without acknowledging.
As a costume. I think that's
costume.
Like those moments where like the kid is wearing a geisha girl costume, or kids are dressing up in costumes as Native Americans, or for instance,
and
sports teams
or caricatures.
Like those,
because even there for me, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just saying that those examples are clearly appropriations that should stop. And that does feel either or to me in those moments where there's a denigration through the appropriation.
You know what I just think? And for me, one of those things is not so clear. And I just remembered a funny thing. Sorry, as you were talking, I was just remembering when you mentioned a girl dressing up as a geisha. Well, the reason I laughed is because what's that show called where the girl is taken in by a right-wing abusive man and they're buried in a Kimmy? What's that show? The Kimmy and there's the hilarious gay Black man.
Unstoppable Kimmy Schmidt or something like that.
Yes, that. And there's a scene in it where people come to protest the Black man because he dresses up as, I don't remember if it was a geisha, but something like that. And it just looks like it's inappropriate. But then he gets up and he was like, I was a geisha in a past life. I learned this. And like Japanese activists are like in here being like, this is so offensive. And then he impeccably sings and sings the song of this Japanese woman from either a story or like a real life thing. And everyone is like, oh, he's like singing it in perfect, like, and it's like long and they're just like floored and like, I, right? But like, and he was just, right. And so that's like a little bit of a funny thing, but it speaks to various dynamics of, to me, that are the nuances of this around, he had to study, like he learned Japanese, he learned that song through and through, and also spoke, I can't, it's a really fascinating scene. Maybe some of y'all can dig it up or find it. I can't remember which season it's in, maybe 2, but maybe somebody can let us know in the comments or something, or post on social media. But there were different elements there that to me was like, oh, that's interesting. And now there may be some people who still think it's inappropriate for a Black man who has no, in this lifetime, connection to Japan to do that. And yet, from a different frame, he did it with incredible integrity. And initially people questioned him, and he backed it up. And so when you talk about the girl wearing the geisha outfit, I think 80% of the time, probably at least in the context of our country in America, it's appropriation. And 5 to probably as high as 20% of the time, it might be a girl who's kind of quite literal and really loves Japanese culture and may end up studying that in school. And so this is why it's nuanced. To me, in general, I think what you're saying is true, for instance, about costumes, but as someone who has often existed within borderlands and reached across lines of difference, and also paid attention and looked for those moments where there are instances where at first I question it, but then I look and I listen to what people are sharing, and I actually think, oh, this is beautiful. This person is an ally. That things aren't always as simple as they seem, and that whether you're talking, and similarly to me, it's sort of like issues around the meat industry or environmentalism, that that in general, if we dealt with the big culprits, and we dealt with the bigger constant problems that are happening, like things at national and city levels, and human mascots and caricatures of people, and whole industries that are built. That's, I think, part of it, is that to me, it can be, it's worthwhile to really think about the ways we individually are implicated in those dynamics and advocate to shift those. And I see what I see happening often is, instead, Tracy, in day-to-day interactions, people are attacking individuals. And often at times the critique is called for, but a lot of times too, it's actually not appropriate. And that person doesn't even inhabit that person, that they're not even a part of that specific culture, and they don't know the context of that person. And they end up attacking people who actually are potentially a part of the solution. That's why this feels so messy to me. But back to you to.
Well, I'm going to bring in yoga now, because I think that
Perfect.
That actually is a concrete example of what you mean, right? So yoga, I read an article recently, and I'll find it and link it in the show notes, about yoga, the Western yoga industry, as an appropriation of South Asian Desi culture. And the South Asian woman, I think it was a woman who wrote this article, was talking about how, where she grew up, the way she grew up, like the word namaste, which we in Western studios is like how you end every practice, is actually a deeply religious thing. It's not a thing that you just like say, and you certainly don't put it on t-shirts. And some of the things that are used as decoration in these yoga studios are actually like religious symbols that are just like up for decoration, or images of Hindu gods, that are just decoration in these yoga studios, that is totally appropriative, to the point that this author was saying how some Desi practitioners, so South Asian, Indian, Pakistani, Sri Lankan practitioners of yoga, can't break in to the Western yoga industry, get passed over for being on the cover of the magazines, and like can't actually make a living practicing their own cultural heritage. And my takeaway from this was kind of what you're saying, April, that it's so much more nuanced. Like, even this person who was writing this article wasn't saying white women stop doing yoga, right? That wasn't the message. The message was pay closer attention and do it in ways that are respectful and acknowledge the source of what you're doing and
Honor it.
treat it with reverence, because it is a religious exercise. And if you just want the workout, don't call it yoga, right? Like, you are not a yogi just because you've done yoga once. That was one of her messages as well, that word gets thrown around as if all practitioners who have ever stood in, Warrior 2 are yogis. And she was saying that that's actually a term of reverence and respect from someone who has mastered this practice that has a spiritual element to it. And that felt, it's a thing that when I said it was like maybe not quite as close as thinking about singing the Negro spiritual at the Passover. Like, I don't have a whole lot of, I personally, and maybe a listener does, I don't have a whole lot of like sentimentality invested in my yoga practice. And so thinking about like how I can, when I do practice yoga, make it a more appreciative and less appropriative, that actually feels like a generative and interesting conversation. And I want to learn more about the culture that generated it. I want to learn more about how it was used, how it is used for those spiritual ends, and like where, like, it makes me want to learn more. It opens me up to curiosity, as opposed to saying like, no, this is mine. I've had it forever. I've been doing it forever, and I like the way I do it. And I think, to me, that kind of reaction is part of what our conversation seems to be encouraging, as opposed to stop doing it altogether. And then that takes away the opportunity for curiosity, or keep doing it exactly the way you've been doing it.
And growth and repair. Like, that's what it is for me, is that there isn't necessarily anything wrong with it per se. Although when you say it that way, there's also a way in which there's something about it that I'm going to say this in the spirit of just being open, and like, I'm not necessarily going to go down this thread, but there's like a very working, when you said it with the way you just said it, there was a part of it that felt like distinctly cultural. And I'm not sure if it's partially working class but there's like a specific thing around just stop. Right. And also to me, in terms of safety and harm and empowerment and ownership, people feel. Whereas, at least I'll speak for me, as someone who feels a sense of deep ownership and belonging with my Jewish people, a number of challenges and ongoing hurts and harms notwithstanding, I just think it's, as you were talking, what came up for me and is that there's an opportunity here for a sacred invitation, and that this can be an appreciative ascension process rather than just ripping something out without thinking about various implications of that. Like, for me personally, my family and our family friends singing the Negro spiritual with my Black and multiracial family and our white Jewish friends, like, I could cry. It was profound. I wanted to sing it at my bat mitzvah. And my mom was like, well, Passover, your bat mitzvah's in October. Passover will have been long ago. We'll figure out another way. But that is how much it meant to me, right? Is that song and other Negro spirituals are sacred. And to do that in Jewish space, the intersectionality of that, to me, is incredible. And to learn and note, and also, I am here for when Jewish leaders of color are calling out and naming, this is appropriative in some ways. And also, you're like, the Jewish community is engaging effectively in reparations and other issues related to our implications directly and mostly indirectly, but still significantly in these different dynamics. I hear that. I'm here for that. But for me personally, don't take away my Negro spiritual during that is, it makes it profoundly relevant, and to acknowledge American chattel slavery feels important. And so I want to lift up a resource that looks like it comes out of a Jewish community and or collective, Beit Ahava, House of Love. I love it. Very aligned with Joyous Justice. And they started this effort called the Passover Song Acknowledgement Project. And as I read through this while I was hearing other conversations, I was like, this is perfect for me in terms of, or like in the ballpark of what I'm talking about a more holistic accountable process. Because to me, to take it a little bit of a step further, the call simply to remove it, to me, is not, it skipped a step, which maybe it did, but of having, and there's not resourcing around this, so I'm not judging anyone who said this, but to me, it skipped a key step of African heritage Jews being able to come into circles or a bigger circle or a group collectively and have a conversation about what this means to us and what we want. Because I don't want to let it go.
Yeah.
I will never be letting it go. Based upon this amazing resource and the work that the folks at Beit Ahava did, I got to see the original lyrics of the song Let My People Go. And I think I would prefer to do that and engage in some of the questions and iterations that they ask. And to be very clear here, there's not some subliminal critique here of different ways that people approach this. I mean, I suppose there is in some sense, in a broader sense, but right now what I mean specifically by that caveat is there is a collective conversation and different people are speaking up and speaking well about their perspective and different perspectives and making different recommendations. And this is not intended to be a critique of that, but more generally what I've seen over the years about how things get simplified to the point where I often find it doesn't actually help, because the people who have a tradition that has some appropriation in it feel stuck and they feel attached, and it's become meaningful for them in some way, right? And so what I like about this resource, and again, we'll link to it in the show notes, is I'll just read through the different sections. So it quotes the traditional Haggadah, and then it goes into what are the origins of the song. So it goes into what are the histories of this? Why should we care who composed the song? What can we do? And it lists out a number of things. Continue to acknowledge the experiences of enslaved Africans, make a yearly Passover contribution to a local organization in our community serving Black people, acknowledging their extraordinary musical contributions to American culture. This just feels holistic and healing, because for me, in some ways, like let's say, even if I was fully on board with the proposal to just remove it altogether, for me as a descendant of enslaved Africans, that doesn't feel sufficient either. Like this has been happening for, like, there's healing and acknowledgement that is needed. And I often think that that is true with a number of dynamics that play out around appropriation, around intercultural blending and mixing in different ways with varying levels of thoughtfulness. What I want, is part of what we already said, is for people to take time to learn and feel a sense of accountability to the source of different pieces, and also think about power dynamics, power and privilege, as Tracy has succinctly said before. And I love it when we did the conversation about feedback, unsolicited feedback and complaint, is in any of these dynamics where there is interaction, we always need to remember that there is power and privilege at play. So being thoughtful about that, and engaging with material and being mindful, and perhaps even checking in where appropriate in mindful ways with people who share some element of that identity, and checking in around sharing what you're thinking about doing. I also think that there's a difference between some internal personal practices versus how we show up in the world and what we share out that impacts other people, right? So what I don't want is a harsher, less nuanced version of these directives to keep people from engaging across lines of difference, from allowing themselves to feel moved and touched and inspired by various cultures and traditions. And I think even talking about this helps to get to the heart of it, is we get to live into those things and mindfully incorporate them into our lives. The part that becomes problematic is when, often without realizing it, we play into old and established oppressive patterns around ownership and entitlement and erasure of the source. And there's lots of momentum in our society and in the world of this being a thing that happens. And so as someone, like, I can't imagine my life without without belly dance. You know, a number of scholars believe that it has its origins in being a form of exercise for pregnant women. Lately, I've been doing spiritual and trauma healing work around my sacral chakra. I've endured abuse and different trauma there. And it's recently occurred to me that before I even knew about belly dancing, I've been shaking my hips, like shimmying and gyrating my hips as a kid and as a teenager. Like, I've been doing that as a kid. And then I was actually avoidant of belly dance because my understanding of it initially as a child, as a young feminist girl, was the appropriated version of belly dance. And then in college, when I took a multicultural dance class and I learned about its origins and that it's essentially like a form of song leading, but through dance for women. And that's literally what I've been doing throughout my childhood. And it felt incredibly compelling. And I've taken classes and it's a part of my inner world that I'm wanting to share. But as I navigate so I can't imagine not having that form of movement that helps me feel alive. But as I've learned about it, I've specifically prioritized learning from Egyptian and West Asian sources of, who are much more proximate and for whom their ancestors were the creators of belly dance. And whenever I engage in it, even as I think about modifying it, I am constantly holding in my mind an accountability to its creators and its source, and a sense of humility and a willingness to make space and back away for people for whom that is deeply a part of their specific culture and history, to articulate what they need to. And to me, it's very much a both and. I just think in this conversation, I want there to be rigor and compassion and space for exploration and mindful intimacy. As I'm thinking about this, I think it's a sort of a longer, I think this could be an accordion. I could say a lot more about this, but I'm going to try to say it concisely. As a number of people are working to contradict dynamics of white supremacy culture, appropriation is very much a part of white supremacy culture and erasure. And there's a way in which, I was going to talk for a moment about Dia de los Muertos and how there was this white queer couple I once knew who would hold an annual ceremony, that a process. And to me, that it's like, you could debate different elements of it. And I one year did a process of Dia de los Muertos in my home. And I decided I didn't tell anybody I was doing it, but I made an ofrenda, basically an altar with offerings, and put photos of my different family members and played their music and songs. And recently I was reading something in one of my Cherokee resources or something of the like. I can't remember maybe it was African. I was reading something that had to do with my culture, and that was a part of it. Mm. Right. And so there are a lot of us of different diasporas who, through the effects of colonization, have lost parts of their culture. And so, especially for people who don't have oppressor or don't have as many particular racial oppressor identities, I also want us to be mindful and not appropriate, but also have space to notice what our soul feels called to and to be able to encounter that. I don't want to be so what I don't want is for us to get so stark that we miss intercultural intimacy and opportunities for accountability and for new things to come forth from there with accountability to our past. So Tracy, I'm curious about what you would love to see in anything that you might not want to see.
Yeah, I think what I would love to see is for folks when questions of appropriation or appreciation are raised, that we are able to, rather than get defensive and like hold on tightly to the way we've been doing it, to see it as an opportunity to learn and deepen and actually improve.
I love that.
Whatever that thing is, so that
Yes.
So that the critique is not personal, but actually an invitation to
Greater awareness, greater depth,
and likely greater meaning. Right.
yes.
I think that feels really important, because I think part of the reason we get defensive is because whatever that thing is meaningful to us. There's some sort of sentimental attachment and meaning that we are making of it. And the call to say, like, wait, is that appropriative, is not to take away the meaning that's been invested, but actually to open the possibility for even deeper and more complicated, in a good way, more complex and
richer
nuanced meaning. And so that's what I would love, is if we could see those moments where we get called in, either literally because someone is saying, hey, this thing that you're doing is appropriative, or because something raises it, in a more passive way. In either case, it's an opportunity to say, oh, I never thought of it that way. Let's think about it.
And welcome that
and see what happens. That's what I would love. And I think what I would like to see us avoid is the inverse of that, where one gets called out and says, okay, fine, I won't touch it. And like, that's not actually helpful either, because it just sort of, to step away and not engage intellectually or spiritually or in any way, to just stop engaging with that thing, that doesn't advance us closer to intercultural competence or appreciation or love or acceptance or justice. That just sort of pushes it away. And so those are the two sides of what I would love to see happen, and what I'm afraid of in the calling out and calling in, is that folks just sort of shut down because they can't hold the dissonance or discomfort of growth.
I may quickly add something to that. I loved what you said. Thank you so much for those pieces. I feel deeply aligned with all of that. And what I would add is when it stopped, is I'm noticing that there's a dynamic that happens around a number of things, but particularly around race and working across lines of difference. This to me, and other people may not for different reasons because of their living, but this to me feels like a teachable moment. And to, as you were saying, to bring more meaning, and also that if we just leave it and we just section that off, then that can, and I see this show up all the time with my consulting and coaching clients, is that they then, since there was an analysis around that, then they misapply that, then they mistakenly apply that in places where actually engagement is important, and or they miss other opportunities because there wasn't time taken to consider and process and learn and internalize it in a way that it's not only about that specific thing, but they understand an underlying principle with some nuance that then they get to continue and carry forward, which again, just is not to say that there aren't times where something is egregious or where there's a particularly painful moment, and temporarily, like I felt that way around the recent Will Smith debacle, where he made a mistake and I saw an overreaction and a lot of racist behavior and language from white people, and very atypical for me. I shared the thought leadership of some Black folks who were saying, asking white people to avoid talking, if at all possible, about this subject, and instead invest in taking time to learn about, and take time to learn and or reflect around, what are the dynamics of racism that contribute to this moment happening and me feeling the way I feel, right? But that was because
that feels very different to me than the case of the appropriation. The disengagement that we're talking about, for me at least, is that specific moment of one has been doing a practice that is not from their culture into which they were raised, or acculturated, and are called out. I think the Will Smith and Chris Rock situation,
and Jada Pinkett Smith.
Yeah, and thank you for naming Jada. I think that's really important. She gets forgotten in the whole conversation a lot. That felt like there was a specific moment where there were different societal dynamics and trauma dynamics that were coming up. So I hear you that's a different case where we're saying, okay, stop a second and just listen, versus for instance, the question of this and
it was a temporary thing for me. It wasn't like never. You can never in this moment. I'm asking for a boundary to be held.
Right.
So
but it's a different situation. But but we could extrapolate too. Like even the question of the Negro spiritual. The thing that I don't want to see is there are some Black Jews who are saying you are conflating by using this song. You are conflating the real harm and experiences of my ancestors with the metaphor. There's an erasure happening by using the spiritual. And so what I don't want to see is like, okay, well, we're not allowed to sing Negro spirituals anymore. And without any examination of, okay, how is it different? What am I missing? And how can I bring that thing that I'm erasing? How can I stop erasing it? How can I actually acknowledge it and honor it? And that's the specific piece that, and to your point, though, it may be the case that for a specific family or even a group of people, maybe temporarily they do need to take a break in order to do the work to get to the other side.
Yeah, I just want nuance here. And as you were talking, my coaching hat like plopped on my head, and I was like, and to me, interestingly, the use of a Negro spiritual in some ways arguably is relatively neutral. And depending upon the way that it's used, it can be neutral, it can be problematic, or it can be healing. And that people are just like are conflating, are potentially conflating a like specific element, the stone metaphor.
Like your stone metaphor, right. Which is just very quickly, this is April's metaphor, but a stone is neutral. It can be used to hurt, it can be used to build. Please carry on.
Or heal, right? But I find in a number of conversations, people are throwing out stones and saying stones are used for oppression. And I'm like, stones actually are neutral in and of themselves. And actually, for me, stones have helped me build homes for people and have helped me heal people. So I'm concerned. Yes, I agree that when stones are used to beat people, that's a problem, but they also are. And so to me, it's similar here, where it depends on the circumstance.
Right.
And we do see, as some wonderful Black Jewish thought leaders have shared, that circumstantially, which I agree with, there is a pervasive issue of people using this classic Negro spiritual in problematic ways.
Right.
But we get to be mindful and think about everything we already said. I mean, at this point, I'm going to, everything already said, and it can be a problem or it's an opportunity. And I love having Blackness and the realness of actual, within the last couple hundred years, enslavement be a part of the Seder. Could it be up-leveled? And could there be more analysis and learning? And as someone who's invested 20 years of my career and life into advancing these subjects within our Jewish community, what I want to see is us leverage this opportunity to learn and get closer and to strengthen our relationships.
Right. I think that the stone metaphor, April, continues to be useful. So like the person who's feeling as though they're being bludgeoned, saying, put the damn stone down, like that makes sense.
Yes.
And that is the appropriate thing to do, to put the stone down. And that doesn't mean that you can't then, after a break, come back and say, okay, I want to learn how to use this stone for building or for healing and not for bludgeoning.
Right. Or if this person experienced this and they had this and then said, anyone who's using stones is problematic. Well, stones get used in lots, and specifically in this scenario, most of the usage of let my people go does need
Right.
but there are variations of that, and the song is beautiful and powerful. And I think that's part of it, is that at times, to me, that's the nuance I've been looking for, my thought leadership that I can use more concisely going forward, is at times there is really a need to excise and cut something out if it's evil, if it's profoundly problematic, if it's just wretched, if it's something like a hate symbol or something that is, something that's abusive. This isn't that. It's truly like a stone. In and of itself, this is actually not even a stone. It's actually sacred. The original Negro spiritual is something among many things that helped literal enslaved humans survive a dehumanizing experience.
And escape it in some cases.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And has nurtured. In some ways it's problematic, so we get to refine that, improve it. Black-Jewish relations in this country. Mm-hmm. It is useful. What we need to shift is not necessarily is the way in which it is used, mm-hmm. and the way in which we think about it. And mm-hmm. we have the capacity to do that. And the last piece I want to end on here really is to say that there are a handful, and specifically one Black Jewish woman, Shekhiynah Larks. We haven't actually met in person, so I hope I am representing you well, who wrote an op-ed about this very subject. And in this moment, having had this whole conversation with you, Tracy, I just want to lift her up and appreciate her courage and her thought leadership. I don't necessarily fully agree with it all, but I very much agree and support with the need for Black Jews and Black Jewish women and Black trans and non-binary Jews to have their voices heard. And I'm feeling grateful and appreciative of her right now because, I don't know if exclusively, but she really led cracking open this conversation that allowed us to, when it prompted us to finally address this issue and put our own stank, our own perspective and analysis and Torah and midrash of it on the broader conversation. And so I appreciate her calling the usage into question and very clearly asserting her boundary. And as is often the case, I support her in that. And my boundary and analysis is a bit different, but I was able to clarify that in part through the inspiration that she provided. So much respect and love. Oh, this is also a really good point for me to give a shout out to Rabbi Becky Silverstein. Recently, he accepted an invitation we gave that I didn't fully remember us giving to engage on social media, engage with subjects we raise on social media. And he did it just so wonderfully. So I also wanted to say that to other folks who regularly listen and who have let us know either through reviews or in passing that you appreciate our material and what we share on this podcast. And I was inspired by Rabbi Becky's response to us. And so I want to extend that out further and just make it clear, if it wasn't already, that even when you're inspired by an episode or something we cover, feel free to engage in the conversation. Feel free to, if it feels comfortable for you to cite it. I mean, obviously in the context that we were just talking about it would be good to attribute us in some way, but you know what I mean? Like you could either be lifting up and repping the episode, which would be cool. But also what I mean is if feel free to use it as something to share your own thought leadership in a way that's similar. If you go to Rabbi Becky Silverstein's Twitter, you'll see where he quoted or shared some of the themes we spoke about in the episode about intellectual intimacy, and then asked and captured some of our questions, and then through a gender-aware lens around trans, non-binary, gender-diverse identities also added additional intersectional questions to our conversation. And as I said on Twitter and on Facebook, this made my heart sing. And so I share that to say he beautifully modeled what it looks like to be in dialogue with us and to appreciate what you like about our content, and then added his Torah, and he has a lot more Torah than just that, but like a slice of his Torah in a midrashic way into our conversation. And I loved it. I think a lot of the things that get shared in different spaces just has more life and depth and richness when other people with knowledge and expertise from parts of their living or their study or scholarship or leadership weave it into the conversation. It's a beautiful model of intellectual intimacy, of taking the material and saying, here's how this is showing up for me, and I wanted to share this with other folks. Feel free, if it's helpful, to use some of our content as a leg up if something we talk about resonates, and it provides a bit of backing for you, and also so that perhaps it can help you feel less alone, and that you're in community with other folks who are either deeply aligned or with whom you are in conversation around something, and that's sacred and great too.
Great news, fam. Grounded and Growing, our 6-week intensive for cultivating a trauma-informed Jewish social justice practice, is a go. While we surpassed the number we felt was essential for the best possible experience, we still have a few seats available. If you considered applying but missed the deadline, this is your chance. We're accepting applications through April 29th or until all seats are filled, whichever comes first. Find the link in the show notes for more and to apply.
Thanks for tuning in. Our show's theme music was composed by Elliot Hammer. You can find this track and other beats on Instagram at Elliot Hammer. If this episode resonated with you, please share it and subscribe. To join the conversation, visit JewsTalkRacialJustice.com, where you can send us a question or suggestion, access our show notes, and learn more about our team. Take care until next time, and stay humble and keep going.